Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this live webinar event, which is focused on answering the question, Building Lifecycle Carbon Assessment, who is responsible? My name is Keir and I'll be hosting the session today. I'm from Arca Works, a business that collaborates using generative design and AI on live projects and works with architects and developers, but also on our innovative software development for the sector. I've been practicing as an architect in London for many years, and I've delivered large projects in the capital with some great design teams, some of whom are joining us today. Working on many different types of projects has demonstrated to me that carbon assessment can play out in many different ways. Today, I've gathered some brilliant experts that I know from the sector to share their ideas. The conversation today is being hosted by Preoptima, a generative design tool that allows users to assess the carbon impacts of their projects and to carbon optioneer their early stages using simple 3D models. We're here today as professionals, but also as enthusiasts, change makers, united by a common goal to reduce carbon emissions in the built environment. Today's session aims to dig into responsibility around carbon estimation and measurement, how it works at present and how it should work in the future. We're going to hear from architects and policymakers who will play a crucial role in driving sustainable outcomes. And I'm going to introduce our panel for today. So first up, we have Niels Raj, Head of ESG at Stanhope. And then we have Bina Nikolova, who is the Principal Sustainability Officer at Westminster County Council. We have Dr. Chan Lee, who is Director at Turner & Townsend and is an LCA specialist. Paulina Pencheva, Architect and Net Zero Researcher at UCL. And Jonathan Unkley, Technical Director at WSP and co-founder of Zero. The format for the session will include a short intro from each of the panelists, and then we're going to have an open discussion together, allowing time for questions from the audience at the end. Please submit your questions during the session, and we'll gather them and put the best one forward to our panel. So without further ado, let's dive into the session. I'm eager to hear from each of our panel. If I could pass to Niels, please could you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Keir. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Niels, and I'm Head of ESG for Stanhope, as Keir mentioned. Stanhope, we're a B Corp. We're a property developer and an asset manager. We're based in London. We're primarily focused on commercial offices and life science space increasingly. And for the context, the car represents about 70% of our value chain carbon emissions. So it's fundamental in our quest to reduce our emissions in line with science. To the question about responsibility, a competent team and that will share the right mindset, but also to brief them appropriately with expectations for clear outcomes and process. Having said that, we certainly require expert advice to tally up, account for embodied carbon, quantify it in our projects, and that's a clear role for a carbon specialist, which will support our design team with quantification of options and the accounting of it all through design and, crucially, construction. But there's a shared responsibility for designers, for lead designers, to produce iterative studies and carbon optioneering. Not to be missed is certainly the construction supply chain, to get as-built information to back up on the assumptions made at design and, crucially, to secure the targeted outcomes. I think two improvements that I can see on the approach that we're taking, where, for the context, all of our approximately 25 live projects in London, the UK, are all undertaking whole life carbon assessments. I think the first improvement would be to move slowly to not just accounting, but more dynamic optioneering of embodied carbon, the tracking of itemized design implications on carbon throughout the stages. I think it's really important, but it's not enough to have a semi-accurate number to report. We want that number to be low. And the second point is an increased focus on supply chain engagement on the matter. We need to engage early, we need to engage often with the trade contractors, confirm that they understand the package level targets that are being set upon them, that they can deliver on them, and importantly, amend them if we think they're way off, and to confirm that we will seek to deliver improvements. So that's a very brief introduction. I'll pass back to you, Keir.
Thanks, Niels. Thanks very much. I'm going to ask Bina to come on stage next, please.
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name is Karolina Nikolova. I work for Westminster City Council along with the planning policy teams, climate emergency teams, although I do sit within town planning. So looking a lot at planning applications and whole life carbon assessments as part of that as well. And I guess today, representing a local authority, I can confirm that we do have a crucial responsibility in standardizing LCAs, for example, in the planning process, but also upskilling officers to match the industry's expertise, and also incentivize both internal and private developing teams to bring down collectively emissions from construction. So I think it is a rare opportunity today that we have to stop pointing fingers and start holding hands, because climate change mitigation requires acceptance of responsibility across all sectors, both public and private. So bringing me back to care.
Thank you, Bina. Next, could I ask Chan?
Thank you, Kia. My name is Chen Li. I'm the Director of Carbon Accounting in the Net Zero Carbon Advisory Group in Turner Townsend. My career is kind of focused on whole life carbon. I've been doing whole life carbon assessment since, I think, 2010, 2011, when I started working with Simon Sturgis. I think for me, everyone in the design team is responsible. I mean, the client, even and the user are included. They're all responsible. But I think there should need to be a clear guidance from somebody in the design team. And I think traditionally, or so far, there's always been a specialist for some major project. If you have a quite strong focus on body carbon, you normally rely on a specialist to drive the process. I think I would love to see if the whole design industry is wising up to this concept. Everybody's starting to understand more and better, and in terms of improve the design methodology, construction methodology, and also the way recording, reporting. But I still think there should be a specialist, can be part of a design team, but it should be a separate role or a separate team or personnel to review and sort of provide unbiased view on design options and track and drive design changes. Okay, and back to you, Kia.
Thanks, Chan. Next, could we speak to Polly, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Polly. I'm an architect with broad experience across sectors and scales of development. I'm currently Net Zero and Circular Economy Fellow at UCL. I'll start by saying that I think it's undeniable that the process of building involves a huge number of different stakeholders across different stages of inception, design, construction, operation, and end of life. In the context of the litigious UK system, we have gone a long way in considering, defining, and agreeing the responsibilities of these stakeholders at each stage. On the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that a building life cycle assessment is a very complex task involving analysis of a huge number of elements which are owned by different stakeholders. And that ownership also changes through the stages. So to assume that only one person is responsible for LCA would be unrealistic, in my view. LCA should be a collaborative effort and everyone should input into it. But it should be owned by a single party to ensure that the methodology is consistent. And this has worked quite well for teams that I have worked with in the past. In the absence of a common standard today, ideally this should be agreed at the start of the project and mapped against the established design responsibilities. And where things fall apart in my kind of experience is when there is no engagement from the team because they haven't been paid for it. In terms of who pays for the actual assessment, well, I think Neil's kind of alluded to that, but the client pays for it ultimately because they pay for everything else, right? And I would like to think that as we upskill and standards emerge in this space, the costs will drop in a similar way to what has happened with BIM services. Clients and contractors pay for the underlying platforms and their management, but all consultants input into the process as part of their standard service. So in conclusion, what key changes I would like to see? I would like to see upskilling across teams, standards for reporting so that requirements are understood across projects and efficiencies can be realized within practices. What we don't want to do is have different standards for each project that we have, because then things get very pricey. And responsibilities have to be mapped against the existing frameworks. There's no point in kind of inventing or reinventing the wheel again. That's me. Back over to you.
Brilliant, Polly. Thank you. I've taken a couple of notes for the discussion later there. I'm going to just pass now to Jonathan.
Hello, my name's Jonathan. I lead the digital services team at WSP, so we're kind of like their future tech consultants. I'm also the co-founder of a community called Zero, hence my light knowledge on sustainability and carbon. And based on the work and the experience I've had of being involved in Zero, I think carbon accountability or accountable carbon or LCA is everyone's responsibility, from policymakers through to the finance ears of project to the leaderships of major companies, and all the way down to the design supply chain have a responsibility to be involved in some way, and that's what we've learned through the work of Zero, of understanding the different levers you can pull. I'd echo the previous point of it needs to sit in one person's camp to physically deliver the methodology, but I believe that every person involved in the construction industry has some kind of responsibility in this emerging space that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right, so now we've heard from all the panelists. We know who everyone is, and we know a sense of what they think about this subject. So I'd like to move into the next section, which is an open discussion. And I'm going to start with a question about competency and skills in the design team. It sounds like there's a degree of consensus that responsibilities should be apportioned something along the lines of a design responsibility matrix. So certain consultants deal with certain things and they need to understand the carbon in that area. And then you need another person who's going to pull it all together with a standard methodology. But what I want to ask is, do we think that we're asking too much of professionals, people coming out of university, entering the profession, from structures, MEP, service engineers, QS, architect? Are they arriving into the profession with the prerequisite skills, and are we expecting too much? And I'd like to see what you think about that, Niels.
Right. I think I need to start by stating the fact that carbon literacy here is absolutely crucial for me, certainly for us as a client that expects a level of carbon being brought into decision making. So we want to work with people that get it, that understand the importance of the matter, and that are equipped to come to us with informed decisions. So yes, clearly, I think all the lead designers that work with us on major projects need to have basic carbon capabilities to bring this into their decision making. I don't, you mentioned having all the answers. I don't think it's necessarily about this, but the ability to quantify the relative implications of design decisions, absolutely. I think the absolute quantification of the total will be made, as we've said, by a specialist. But on the sort of relative basis, comparison of relative options, yes, we expect the structural engineers to come to us with different structural solutions and grids and understand the carbon implications of that. The underground works, whether or not we'll have a basement, will make a massive difference through the early doors, and our architects need to have a view on percent materiality and what that means for the ultimate carbon numbers. I think on the who should pay point, yes, as we've said, we as a client will definitely pay for the assessment, we'll pay for the expertise. Mm-hmm. But I think increasingly the costs of training and being able to be a practice, as an architecture practice, structural engineering practice, that this goes on, that is able to bring this as part of their service and their advice to clients, for me will become a license to operate. It will impact whether or not we work with certain practices.
So in that sense, it's you see it as just a basic prerequisite upskilling needed in all organizations, and if they're not able to do this in-house as part of the standard service, they're essentially not going to give you the sort of level of service that you would need as a client. Is that fair to say?
I think on major projects, and you mentioned people out of university, there's certainly an upskilling that is required throughout the process, but the practices need to bring in as a way, I think, to remain relevant given the importance of this in our field.
Yeah. So I think of Stanhope as sort of doing major projects and a very responsible developer. What about on sort of smaller projects? Polly, could you comment on sort of how you see this question applying to other sorts of project environments that aren't maybe sort of doing headquarters buildings in central London? What do you think in terms of skills and expertise that we expect teams to have, out of the box?
Yeah, I do think it is a big ask for small projects, especially under a certain size and team size as well. In terms of whether we are asking too much, maybe from the older generation, and upskilling there is definitely harder and more expensive probably. But successful businesses have to adapt to a changing world, and therefore businesses have to invest in the emerging technologies and the emerging concepts and emerging emergencies. And so do educational frameworks. And I am kind of involved in architectural education, and it is something that I'm advocating for, not only in architectural education, but beyond in terms of engineering as well, and hope that the next generation of consultants, which are emerging out of universities kind of in the next few years, will understand those fairly new concepts much better and be able to take on the lead even very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So now I want to think about how the anatomy of a design team, like a typical design team, how it's made up, and I have a sort of quite traditional sense of who I'd expect to see in a design team. Gradually, we've seen the design team grow over the years as different specialisms have emerged around, say, health and safety or BIM. Yes, I think we see LCASs on large projects quite often, not throughout though. And I want to ask Chan, what do you think about the sort of modern design of design teams, as it were? Like, is the standard way of arranging a design team correct? Is it fit for purpose? Is it going to work into the future, or do you see us needing to arrange ourselves slightly differently?
Okay, sounds clear. I think there's two ways to look at it. One is the standard way. I don't think static is correct or is helping us to resolve this issue for built environment. I think we need change. We're constantly asking for change, so the design team needs to change. And either by adding different specialists onto the program, onto the project. Again, I take your point, for large projects, this may be easier to accommodate, or a large organization can easily accommodate this. But for smaller projects, just keep bolting on specialists may not be the answer, cost-wise and availability-wise. And that will require the design team to wise up, again, as I said, to update their knowledge or their research or their skills to do this sort of things. Because again, for smaller projects, the LCA assessment may be easier. And again, if you're just trying to focus on big areas, then your impact compared to large buildings are probably smaller, but then means you have less effort to spend on doing the assessment again, and may make the life and the evolve on our assessment enforcement easier. But again, I will say the design team need to involve. If you keep, again, with the new technology and everything started, you can't keep the same structure of the design team as always. You need to adapt, not only for embodied carbon, whole life carbon, you need to adapt for all other things. So it's just one of the changes you need to embrace.
And Jonathan, do you see that in terms of applying to all projects of different kinds, and in terms of what's people's readiness in terms of picking up tools? You work a lot in sort of innovation and new tools. What do you think about teams' readiness?
I think, interestingly, so I over the last decade, I've been involved in kind of digital adoption across lots of different projects and teams. I think the industry is very saturated with tools, and it's kind of got kind of new tool fatigue in a lot of ways. It's done a heck of a lot of adoption of different platforms and different systems, and now it's a lot harder for new systems to make it through the door companies, because they're just people don't have the bandwidth. I think as a role, and what was mentioned earlier, it needs to be everyone's responsibility in some way to have the ability to reduce carbon from designs or understand the impact of the decisions that they're making on projects. Because there's going to be on the large projects, there's going to be the specialist doing the measurement, but on the majority of the projects that are a little bit smaller, there just isn't going to be the specialist there. So people having the ability to understand the impact of the decisions they're making is really important.
Do you think that that teams really can see that though? Like say you've got some complex piece of software that's doing the assessment, and you've got one person in an organization that can use it. Like, how easy is it for a design team or set of designers to actually design with that as a constraint and to actually understand it? Or is there a bit of a like, okay, do our design, go and speak to the LCA person, once at the end of the stage? How dynamic is it?
If the tool's really good, user friendly, and and easily adoptable, then 100%. Like, I love the emerging trend of the front end tools that particularly architects are picking up. I think that the more traditional carbon tools are a bit of a black box for a lot of people, and they're driven by very, very complex data sets that people don't understand or really have got to grips with. We've seen examples where we've tested tools at like Reba 3-ish, and the data sets that have been used have given 100% variation on results from what is ultimately quite a good design at that point, or quite a rationalized design. And at that point, it's usually too late anyway. But the front end concept tools that are appearing that are very user friendly, dead easy to adopt, that's the easier you can make it for people, the better, in my opinion.
Yeah, so maybe we need to, something I would observe from speaking to lots of people that do LCA assessments is there's a lot of desire to justify all of the numbers that you put in and to really be clear on why you've made certain assumptions and to have accuracy. But I wonder if that pursuit of accuracy and sort of finite detail means that you do get huge variance between projects and it's actually not that consistent. And would it be better to have more assumptions and just focus more on reduction rather than like just trying to measure every single screw in a particular way and doing it differently to the person next door?
Yeah. I think it's Finland where the government has given people a set of guidance to level the playing field from carbon measurement. I think it's Finland.
Because it's that as well.
What's that, Polly?
France as well.
That's a much better way to do it, isn't it, really? If everyone's got a level playing field that they're measuring from, then people aren't worried that their variation is wrong because everyone's measuring from the same kind of assumptions. That's got to be that's a good step forward.
Yeah. So
coming from planning policy and town planning perspective, I have to say there is a really wide variation between different teams and applicants, and that poses, well, one, of course, it's very hard to understand what assumptions have been made, if they're correct, but also it poses a big risk for policymakers because they can't use that data. They don't know if the data that they have is actually correct or not, and we're yet to see whole life carbon assessments done at post-construction to kind of confirm validate what's being assumed at design stage. But I do have to disagree that assumptions are also they can play in both ways, because early stage assumptions so far at planning, we see them play always in favor with the applicant's team. So the team will swing the numbers one way or another. So we do need to also kind of measure every screw approach to ensure that this is not always the case.
Well, that's a good point. And so, can I ask a bit more about methodology, and maybe we talk about building retention versus demolition? How much does the methodology and the way that an argument is presented impact your perception of the carbon, stats around a project and how it's performing, and the ultimate sort of development decision to either demolish or maintain a building and refurbish it? Like how much consistency do you see in methodology in that area, for example?
I think the methodology is there because there's no, I don't think there is any kind of disagreement between the private and the public sector that retaining building is less carbon intensive than demolishing and having a brand new building. It has to be also in relation to what you're trying to achieve with the sites. And I think that is where the kind of the level of expectations not much. So it is a very important question, and it goes back to what is expected from the site and what is the policy framework there. So for example, with the introduction of policies, and I'm going to throw it here, it's the retrofit first policy that we're looking at. I know everyone wants to hear about it. So we do aim to actually resolve this. So giving much needed clarity to the developing community of what is expected moving forward from all of their current, but also from their future assets. And our next step is also to collaborate on a mapping exercise, for example, across the city, introducing embodied carbon assessments on existing buildings. So this to align a little bit more with the new RICS methodology, understanding what's already there, what's already built, maybe understanding carbon in a little bit different way, or carbon budgets, but also identifying buildings that might be at risk of demolition. So this is the local government's strategic approach. However, there is a limit to also what we can do, including shifting the narrative that, for example, optimizing the site to have an uplift of 100% or more floor area, which is it makes almost impossible for existing buildings to achieve. We then need to understand how can also the private developing community, their teams that work within under a brief can understand that there might be a different alternative to the way that they look at buildings today, and the optimization might seem to looking at in a different way. So there is this right balance really between, I guess, growth and, shall I say, greed.
It does seem like often, like particularly contentious policy issues or planning issues arise out of maybe a development plan that was brought forward like several years before, and the land might have been purchased many years before under a certain assumption of scale that can be achieved on that site, which maybe in 2023 or going forwards you might take a different view on, with retention and retro first being a different agenda. Can I ask Niels, what are your thoughts on this in terms of development appraisals and getting carbon assessment in really early in the process? How do Stanhope think about that?
I think, as Habina explained, the regulatory scrutiny in the matter, I think, as we've heard, is very clearly is increasing, certainly in central London, and that's absolutely a good thing. I think that will force appraisals not to take the redevelopment options for granted, and that early optioneering is now being forced from stage one, and we're seeing this on active schemes at the moment, is definitely a good thing. In terms of how we take that on our side on board, we carry a carbon price in our appraisal that's directly proportional to the embodied carbon of the building. So there's also an incentivization here to keep reducing this. The point I want to make, one point I want to make on top of this, though, is I think retention is also not binary. It's really a spectrum. The extent of retention in terms of area of existing of volume of facade retention can vary enormously. So behind this word of demolition retention, it's really not that binary. That's where we really need to factor in the whole life approach. Currently, there's an over reliance on operational performance from sometimes local authorities, certainly sometimes from occupiers, and that can lead to suboptimal carbon outcomes. If you need to replace your facade to hit certain operational performance thresholds, that will lead you down an unintended consequence path.
Well, if I can jump on this, actually, whole life carbon, it might not be the right approach if you look at retention specifically for the existing structure, because if as you said, there is a spectrum of how much is a retention. Let's say we pick the UK's net zero building standard definition. So anything 50 or more % of the existing structure is considered, let's say, retention. If we look at existing buildings, the majority of those buildings can be retained because now we have the expertise, the technology, the frame can exist and be brought up to the required level of operational energy. Maybe a little bit short from passive house design, but pretty good. So we are trying to address emissions, the upfront emissions, because we only have 6 or less years left. And that is where really the focus is when we have that conversation of demolition versus retrofits. So the whole life carbon, different story, but you should not justify
To be clear, I think we're saying the same thing. I'm saying sometimes the reliance on wanting to minimize operational leads you to a path where you emit more carbon today, which we don't want to do. So chasing operational performance will, you can't achieve a neighbor's 5-star with an extinct facade if you're being pushed to do that by certain standards that will force you to emit more carbon in this critical decade, which we're saying is not the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Can I sort of zoom out a little bit now and just ask, this isn't really an open question, but maybe I'll point it at Paulina first. How is the UK doing versus other locations, or maybe how is London doing versus the rest of the UK? What ideas can we see in other places that feel more progressive and more the direction that things need to go? What have you seen from your research, Polly?
Yeah, I think internationally there are some very interesting examples, and I think the discussion on what happens in the consultant level is really interesting to frame that, because what is missing, and there's an obvious disconnect between kind of grassroots approach and what the industry is requesting and where the government, kind of central government policies sit at the moment. In terms of internationally, whole life carbon and embodied carbon regulations exist at national level in some of the European countries and at state level in the United States. So, for example, the Netherlands, they had the building decree in 2012, so quite a long time ago, actually, and it's very well established, which requires new buildings larger than 100 square meters to have whole life carbon calculations and carbon mitigation costs estimates. And they're using a national methodology for that. So they have very kind of equal playing kind of field. And then France passed on the RE 2020 bill, and in early 2022, it came into force, which requires whole life carbon calculations for all new housing projects, with an emphasis on the use of wood in construction. Again, an area where the UK is very far behind. And reduction targets in terms of embodied carbon and operational carbon are set incrementally to achieve the national carbon neutrality goal in 2050. And at state level in the US, California kind of leading the way. In the UK, despite the publication of the Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy and the Future Home Standard, which actually hasn't come into effect yet, and who knows, it might never do, there remains nothing in national policy that requires embodied carbon emissions to be measured or controlled, other than on voluntary basis. So it does fall down to kind of individual members of kind of different local authorities or different developers to kind of come up with their own methodologies. And that is a huge risk for me and something that needs to be addressed.
Because you'll have like every area's got a different opinion about something.
Exactly. And what is, I mean, it's fantastic that Westminster are doing this, but then in the borough next to them, they might have a completely different methodology, and economies of scale would not work when everyone is taking a different approach.
But then some ideas we see at a local level have been quite good. So like, for example, the City of London have released this PAN document, which is around carbon optioneering as part of the pre-application process, something that I'm sure other local authorities are looking at and thinking, maybe we should do that. So maybe that more decentralized decision making could lead to more, I don't know, innovation or new ideas rather than a central authority. What do people think about that?
I'd like to build on the previous point before I move on to that one, if that's okay.
Go for it.
So I think the UK can quite often get excited about how good it is. Like, I think there's some amazing stuff internationally being done in decarbonisation in construction, particularly in South Korea, the Asian markets, in China. There's some amazing work in terms of the advances they're making on low carbon concrete and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I think the UK has still got a lot of work to do in the other things it's trying to fix in construction. So, like, for example, digital adoption on projects is still quite often dropped out of smaller projects because it's seen as too expensive or nice to have. The way when you take away the top end and the cream of projects, particularly in London and potentially Manchester, that there's still a huge amount of local councils that are struggling with things like adoption of BIM that was mentioned earlier. Like, it's just too expensive for them. So what we don't want is things like LCA and carbon measurement to be pushed down the chain because there's other things that are taking precedent. Some of the projects I'm working on, fire stopping compliance is taking precedent over everything because of the Building Safety Act. Recent project, every single fire stopping detail was made into concrete that was originally a lower carbon solution, but because of fire stopping compliance, they had to change to concrete. So this, and carbon was kind of like, oh, well, what's more important, low carbon or fire stopping? So there's so many, and that's one of the difficult things with construction. There are so many things pulling you in different directions. It's what takes priority. And I've always the opinion of, I mean, carbon is such a relevant, important topic.
Yeah,
but it's difficult for design professionals when you've got so many things pulling in different directions, and that's why I see it as an all solutions approach. That it needs policy, it needs business leadership, it needs banks, it needs financing to kind of really shape the way we deliver stuff fundamentally from the ground up. Really,
Can I ask then about, so that was a really good example of just like a nitty gritty, like fire stopping is actually not understood, or it's not aligning with low carbon approaches. Well, in the design team in general, I think I've always felt like structures certainly has a very big impact on embodied carbon, but also structural engineers were very quick to get skilled up and start reporting their numbers very well. And now I think structural engineers are excellent on embodied carbon in general, but probably can't say that about the whole design team overall. And I wonder, I would like to hear from Chan actually on where you think we can get bigger improvements in the design team, like which professionals need to really skill up and improve their game, and which parts of the embodied carbon equation are not really being tackled yet, and are kind of therefore good targets to go after next. Chan.
Thank you, Kia. I think to echo your point, I think the structural engineers, they are quite front on this journey. Yeah. If you look at all the documentation published by iStruct, the calculators, the methodology, and the effort that each structural engineer are doing, and almost all the projects I worked on with any sort of structural engineer, they all calculate embodied carbon almost like by default, and rather than offering as an additional fee or service, so that they see this as a must. It's also a way to retain good client, like Neil mentioned. They understand the urgency. I think for architects, although RBA published the 2030 target, but I think I would like to see more effort and more guidance and more demand from architectural practice of sort of RBA to drive and to drive the charge. And think the things, I know that the structural structures and take about a large proportion of buildings' carbon footprint, especially at the beginning, at the completion. But if you start to go into more detail in MEP, in facade, you start realizing they actually contain also a large majority, a non-negligible proportion. Yeah. And also factor in the life cycle, you will realize, okay, the MEP needs to be replaced. And then the internal finish may be replaced more than maybe 3-4 times, and even more. And then you realize, those things all add up. And they need to be considered. So I think the MEP consultants are getting started to consider. But I think also there's a large gap in the development in the journey. I know there's lots of good work been done by CIPC, TM65, etc., and 60 about lighting design, about MEP, embodied carbon. People start to do this, but I think there's a lot of maybe still easier gains we can look into from MEP. Because for structures, there's lots. Maybe the early easy ones are been done or been easily taken, and it's just. But there's a big untapped thing. Hopefully, we can still get from the MEP aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see Jonathan's got an opinion about MEP on site. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, it's to do with the fact that the way that MEP designers are contracted to design, they're contracted to spatially coordinate the services within a particular area. They're not there to design the nuts and bolts, the details of the services, and that's just the nature of what that BG6 gives them to design. So at the point it goes to site, they're like, can I get, and this is where fire stopping gets complex, can I design the services within this zone? And if it's yes, they're happy, because that's what they're contracted to do. Doesn't necessarily mean, and that's where measuring embodied carbon gets difficult, because they don't know, to go back to Bina's point, they don't know what screws they're going to put in there. They know that there's going to be a service in that zone, and that's with this kind of performance. So it's embodied carbon and MEP is always the elephant, because
sounds like there's a big opportunity there for a great MEP engineer to get some sort of predictive tool to actually give live embodied numbers on their designs. I'm not sure if that's I'm aware of a couple of things looking at this, but I don't know of a really comprehensive solution for that yet. So
the tool is only as good as its inputs, and at the moment the blocker from this is the supply chain. The manufacturers don't have the information of the complex part that will make an air source heat pump or these components. So the tool can only be as good as what we feed it. At the moment, we don't have good data to feed it.
And so fire stopping is going to change everything. And fire stopping is going to change everything in that space, because they can't change this one. The way the Building Safety Act is going to change things is they can't change products. They're going to be fixed to products at certain stages. So it is going to start to improve that process. Even though it's fire stopping, in theory, it should improve the type of systems that they have to design, because they can't change the product at stage 4 anymore.
But also hopefully give incentive to other manufacturers to step up their certification game and actually provide more products on the market which are certified for those purposes. Because with the recent changes in fire stopping, the biggest challenge has been all the kind of pulling of details from suppliers and from manufacturers of fire stopping systems. They've literally just retracted loads of details that were previously certified, and suddenly they're not. And that's why projects end up just filling things with concrete, because that is the only tested solution. So I think there is, with any kind of central policy that impacts economic and kind of business impacts further down the supply chain, have to be very carefully evaluated before it's rolled out, really. And I'm not sure that these have been.
Well, I guess a very practical solution, just to jump on what Polly was saying, and I guess it goes around counting the carbon and just getting on with it, is finding if the building is known, or the team who did the building previously is known, finding the guys who installed the MEP. That is probably the most practical way we've seen so far, where MEP elements have been reused. They're not necessarily recertified, but I guess they're reused in the sense that there would have been with a retrofit project, although there is a new build element to it. So there are, I guess, tricks around that. It's still quite emerging, but I guess embedded knowledge in MEP is something that we should start searching for more.
Yeah, and if the pieces of equipment don't yet have like really good data on them, then wouldn't it just be good to know how many pieces of equipment you have, and to have some sort of nominal number against it, and we can just swap that in later? If in the absence of knowing exactly what the embodied carbon of every component within a Mitsubishi air source heat pump is, would be good to just know how many air pumps you have, and a sort of rough estimation of what that means for different design options.
I mean, that data should be emerging now from BIM models, but again, it is down to the competency of
You
the
need to
design
have a good
team.
BIM. You need to have. You
I
have to
would
have
be-
a service engineer using BIM.
You would know how many air source heat pumps there were. You wouldn't necessarily know the embodied carbon of them.
No, but
I would
you
be
know,
shocked at that space.
as more data emerges, you might be able to go back and.
For me, it's like I can understand why it's complex to get an embodied carbon number on an air source heat pump, but I still think some number must be better than no number. Right.
Yeah,
and
100%.
just make it a bigger margin of error. Can I? I'm going to move on to I think the final question of the panel discussion. So we are going to take questions in a minute. So please get your questions in on the comments section. I'd like to just conclude this part of the conversation with a discussion around whether we, coming to the end of 2023, have we got our priorities right as a sector? So we've talked about operational carbon, we've talked about embodied carbon, we've talked about circularity. I'd like to hear from the panel about where they think we should be looking and really focusing next. I feel like Bina, you had strong opinion that actually it's all about upfront carbon because we've only got 6 years left. I know that other people care a lot about circularity and end of life. So maybe you could start with you, Bina, on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Going back to my original point, it's the urgency that we need to look at things with. It is a lot about everyone counting the carbon, knowing how to count carbon, but also understanding intuitively what might result in less carbon emissions. So a local authority has a big portfolio. We have a lot of regeneration projects. We need to deliver a lot of housing. So upfront emissions and also be in line with our net zero ambition. So that is extremely hard. So we need to come up with very scalable solutions very quickly. So innovation is very important. One focus is the industry being brave in their innovation approach, and second, collaborative approach on big wins. So big regeneration projects is where all the carbon will go moving forward, and less so in more flexible use.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to jump in on this one?
There's a really easy piece of low-hanging fruit with embodied carbon. I still hate the statistic on construction sites that 12% of all cost is errors and waste. Like basic things like that, we really need to address. And just stop. Think about it. There's some of the statistics in the UK. It's like 37% of all waste that goes into landfill is from construction sites. 12% of cost on construction sites is waste. Like that's just easy carbon mitigation that probably doesn't come into LCA type stuff.
Are we celebrating low waste projects enough?
No,
I don't think we are.
no.
I don't think we are. I think to your question, there's a definite rebalancing that we need towards embodied carbon for the reasons we touched on earlier. So I won't repeat, to avoid short-sighted focus on operational driving increased upfront carbon in the critical decades. We clearly need better regulations forcing it, even just the evaluation of it before setting hard targets, as Pudima explained, as many of our peers in the continent are doing. And that's really important to me, to capture the long tail of organizations that just aren't the leaders, that will do it no matter what. We tend to talk about this, but there's an awful lot that without tough regulations simply won't move. But I think your point was right, that we don't celebrate low waste projects. So the circularity aspect, I think, to some extent, it's an enabler of low embodied carbon. So, on some projects we go live at the moment, we're bringing in secondhand pieces of steel. About 50% of the new structure we bring in is secondhand steel. The raised access floor tile is another obvious example. Well, typically, even on a new build, would be like top 3, top 5 of our highest carbon hotspots of using secondhand here. will mitigate a resource use and an embodied carbon options. But in fairness, there's also a lot of positive outcomes towards material and resource reuse that will, the benefits of that will be seen elsewhere. So I'm thinking of a strip out that we've done last year in the city. 90% of all the waste was directly either reused or recycled, and out of this, a direct reuse of 14%, which I think is something we're quite proud of. 50,000 raised access floor tiles went on to be reused directly elsewhere. About the same number, 48,000 carpet tiles reused directly elsewhere. That's about 2/3 of what was in the building, and that's an outcome to be proud of from a resource usability. But the carbon benefits of this, we don't see in our own building, for instance, of being able to, we're not going to store these tiles ourselves for a period. We want to be able to feed them into a circular economy to benefit from them in 4 years' time when we need them. But I think it's also okay to not see this benefit in our projects. But at the moment, we don't have this metric to celebrate it. The difficulty to add metrics alongside this is like who's got time and expertise to grasp it all. It starts to become a lot Paulina.
Yeah, I guess it's. I think we just need to differentiate between the whole life carbon and kind of reuse of materials used within kind of the designs and new builds and refurbishment versus the kind of concept of full reuse at the end of a life of a building, and also the kind of operational kind of side once the building is fully functioning. Because in kind of my mind, they're like two separate things that we need to just address equally, but in a targeted way, so that one doesn't hide behind the other. And I think what I've seen across the industry is that a lot of people hide behind the operational carbon savings and don't address embodied carbon savings. That is a big issue. And rightly so, Westminster Council have responded in the way they have and said, no, actually, embodied carbon is really important for us. And if there was more of a balanced view between the two, then that would be kind of the golden kind of ticket, really, in considering circularity in materials for the use, but also embodied carbon and operational carbon, whole life carbon assessments, really be the dream.
Okay, so unless there are any more sort of eager beavers on that question, we are going to move into the Q&A section now. I think so we've got some questions have come in. I think Sarah's going to queue up some of those on screen. I haven't seen them. So here's the first one. What advice would you give to calculating carbon in developing countries where there is limited data, particularly in the early stages of design? Who wants to talk on this one?
Maybe Jonathan. Yeah.
I think I'll give it a
go. Go on.
Funny enough, because I used to calculate carbon before being an officer at Westminster. I did a study on handmade bricks in Nepal, and it's funny because sometimes you don't need to. If it's a local, traditional, indigenous construction, it's very likely they will be very low carbon. But then it is also, it's not to say that we shouldn't be calculating carbon for very big, extensive master plans in the cities. So it is very important that actually, interestingly, I think there is a kind of opportunity there to have a knowledge exchange between traditional low carbon methods of construction in developing countries and the methodologies, carbon counting, and the kind of digital solution on the other hand in the global north. So we need to really explore that opportunity more.
Can I sort of add my input? Actually, as somebody actually from a developing country, and I think that the way of manufacturing construction element are not so different. The difference is in the grid. So the methodology can be adopted quite easily.
Okay.
And again, we're not talking about sort of local manufacturing. I'm talking about sort of if you're building a city in Saudi,
Right.
the way the
The grid is, you mean it's like it's fossil fuel grid, not
yes,
nuclear
fossil
or
grid,
not,
and then
or wind, yeah.
you can adapt the same methodology, but
Yeah.
then you use a more sort of a higher carbon factors, but you can find those published sources, and it's not that difficult. So I think the methodology we're developing in the UK or in Europe is adaptable. And again, in my previous role, we developed this carbon tool for Hong Kong region, and it's to again, we've researched material databases. Again, that's how I learned the carbon factors or the processes are
Got it.
sort of in line generally.
That's great. Any other responses on this? I've got 2 more questions lined up. So we can move on to the next one, maybe. Sarah? What have we got next? Here it comes. Growth in the number of assessments required points towards software to help do a humanly impossible task. What is the willingness to pay, and whose responsibility is it to pay for software to help? Who should we point this one out? Maybe Polly, you could start, and then maybe Niels afterwards. What do you think, Polly?
Yes, I mean, the software comes, I guess, in the package price that you get for paying for a assessment, right?
Yeah.
So again, like the client ultimately will pay for it. For all small projects, that is more of a challenge because what are the priorities there? But then
Is the client
that's where agreeing rules of thumb and using free software to help with kind of basic elements, or like free toolkit and tools which are available online.
Yeah.
There are many of them that are really good actually, and you don't have to pay extra for it. So you just need to have the knowledge of where to find them and how to use them, and they're designed in a very simple way. So I don't necessarily think it's about cost when it comes to making the right decision.
Yeah, I think a lot of architects in particular, they're very keen to be able to report well and to use it as a design tool, but they're not often being paid to do LCA as part of their scope. So there's usually, particularly on a medium or large project, there's an LCA assessor. So is it, I guess, Niels, your point at the beginning was that, of course, it's basically part of your competency. You should be able to give us an answer on carbon, and that's part of your overhead. So you just need to manage it.
Yeah, I think the point I tried to make earlier was also, again, on not necessarily getting the stress you're describing of the architect having to get the perfect answer. What I'm more saying is relative optioneering, A against B. What is better? What is worse?
Yeah. Percentage reduction.
If you use the same tool, the error is disappearing. So that I think that's really what I'm after. And then yes, on larger project, we can have budgets to have specialist competency to make sure we've got an actual accurate tally at the end of it. On the question here, definitely agree with Paulina on the breadth of and wealth of tools that exist that are free. And I really want to reiterate the point that I think we can get really bogged down talking about the perfect tool, but what I think is maybe more important for us to realize is it's more is the data, is engagement with manufacturer, is the role of clients to mandate the use of environmental product declarations to get accurate data to feed into these models, not whether we use the newest, shiniest tool. If we feed it poor information, we will get poor result.
So, interesting statistic from a recent construction conference on EPDs. There was a survey done of all the manufacturers that were there, and 87% of the construction product manufacturers had never heard of the term EPD yet.
Oh wow!
Which was quite sad.
I think that is one of my biggest. So what I've done in practice before is test out a very easy, very high level tool at stage 1 even. Which is literally just using standard BAF carbon data set to plug in systems. So you use concrete system versus a steel or this or that or the other. It's an Excel spreadsheet. And we tested that, and then we benchmarked it against the really detailed analysis coming out of a software, which I'm not going to name.
Definitely don't name that software.
But the kind of main software which is used for detailed analysis and kind of stage 3 and 4 by LCA kind of assessors. And the outcomes were pretty much the same. So, and on top of that, when you sit down with an LCA assessor and you go through all of the kind of inputs into that really detailed assessment, I echo that the EPDs are just not accurate, and you're making an approximation of what is kind of the closest possible product data that you can find. And often, like, basic materials in the UK that are like widely used across every single building don't have basic data inputted, and you have to compare it to like a product somewhere in the United States and France, and obviously that's not the same. So I think it's important to get the kind of baseline big picture and make those early options stack up. And then when it comes to the detailed assessment, that's where the push from policy and industry needs to come to really kind of get to the nitty-gritty of it. And we're not there yet, so I wouldn't worry about it that much.
Thank you, Polly. I've seen, Jonathan, you've posted a link to Building Transparency, which I think has a free database of EPDs. Is that correct? You're muted, Jonathan.
Yes, I think that's just in our chat, though. I don't think anyone else will see that. But Building Transparency is a free tool for EPDs, basic carbon assessments on projects.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for one more. We are just over an hour, but we'll wrap up in the next 5 minutes. So final question from the audience is, who should be responsible to upskill the workforce to understand the interplay between embodied carbon, operational carbon, and circularity?
That's a long question to answer.
It's a big question.
So essentially, I guess this is like CPD. It's what's happening in terms of like continued professional training. Is that organization level? Is it the responsibility of each practice or business to keep training their staff in the latest? Or actually, should there be more like regulatory level or like professional bodies that do it?
There's probably a bit of everything there, isn't there? It's like ultimately the organizations need to upskill their staff so they can keep delivering projects in a professional manner. Just like what Nils mentioned earlier, they need the level of service. The institutions need to back this up. So the REBAs, the SIBCs, and individually as well, you need to. It's going to be a key part of what you deliver for the future of your career. Therefore, you need to pick up a bit of learning as well. So it's probably an all solutions kind of angle, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, do we have any more strong opinions on this question? If not, we will start to wrap up.
I was just wondering whether it's worth mentioning the carbon literacy project that has been rolled out across local authorities.
Please do.
Which is quite a good initiative. I don't know if Bina has any more insights into that. But a way in which local authorities are trying to upskill from kind of research that we've done at UCL recently is through carbon literacy and CPDs as well at local authority level. And that is something that is actually a model taken from industry and public practice, which is a model that was kind of pioneered with architects going into local authorities in different positions, has been quite crucial in kind of doing that. So there are many ways in which upskilling can happen, and it's the responsibility of everyone to do it.
Bodies like the UK Green Building Council also would be remiss to not mention them, that they're doing a really good job at putting free resources out.
London, they've been of really big help for the past few years. They're now coming out of the Circuit 2020 project, so they're kind of becoming the leading body in upskilling, particularly local authorities, but also moving forward. Watch their space. They're trying to achieve something much bigger than that. So we are hopeful that there'll be a lot easier access, because there are all these different kind of knowledge hubs, but what is the right one to always tap in? It's not very clear.
Thank you, Bina. Jonathan, you've just posted a link on the private chat that no one else can see, but it's some sort of resource from Zero. Maybe you could just tell us quickly about that.
Basically, the main piece of work Zero's done is created an externally facing playbook built by the community on how to decarbonize projects, and that's a link to it that's free to use and access. You can even comment and edit it if you want, if you think it's wrong. But it's quite an interesting piece of work.
Thank you, Jonathan. We will try and make sure that that link is included when we post this video later. So it comes to me to wrap up the session. I just want to extend my warm thanks to all of you for joining us today in this critical conversation about LCA in the built environment. Thank you to our host, Preoptima, who will be making a recording of the session available to the public in the coming days. And thank you once again for your participation and enthusiasm. Until next time, keep pushing things and challenging your teams to continuously improve. Thank you very much and goodbye.